Alright, so this video was meant to be out like a week ago, but I actually got sick the week of March 5th and couldn't record that whole entire week, so despite most of you already having likely seen it, this video will contain no major spoilers for the Super Mario Bros. Movie. With that being said, enjoy. So, after 5 years of waiting, the Super Mario Bros. Movie is finally out, and this is kind of a big deal for me. You see, I'm something of a toddler, and Mario is a series that's been in my life since I was 6. I could probably play most of the main games for the rest of my life and never get bored of them. Granted, I have moved on to a lot of other series, and I don't go back to Mario as much, but it's a lot like a friend who I may not talk to much, but always has my back. So, it's kind of a cruel twist of fate that only now a full-fledged Super Mario Bros. Movie has finally been released. If this movie had come out in the early to mid-2000s at the peak of my love for Mario, it probably would have been my favorite movie ever by default. But how does it stack up against 20-year-old miserable weeaboo me? I will say up front right now that I haven't seen the 1993 live-action Mario movie, neither have I seen the late 80s OVA, and I don't really want to, in all honesty, so I can't compare them. I will be bringing up one of them later in the video when we get into the second half. You see, the day before this movie released, it really got me thinking about the status of video game adaptations and Nintendo's place in them, or lack thereof. I've got quite a bit to say there, so stay tuned. Basically, in the first half, I'll talk about Mario, and in the second half, I'll ramble on about God knows what. Without any further ado, let's get into the Mario half. When it was announced all the way back in January 2018 that Nintendo would be teaming up with Illumination to make an animated Mario movie, me and many others expected the absolute worst. The studio who made those shitty, cheap, cutesy, marketable animated movies getting their grubby hands on Mario? No fucking thanks. Yeah, Miyamoto was working closely, but surely that wouldn't save things. Years passed, and finally on September 21st, 2021, we got the cast announcement, and I don't think I've ever been louder in an announcement. It had to be a joke, right? Chris Pratt and Seth Rogen in a Mario movie? Was this an out-of-season April Fool's joke? It would be a while before we got a real trailer, and it actually didn't look half bad, to be honest. You had some of Illumination's best animation work, plenty of non-throwaway references to the games, some of the voices sounded fitting, for the most part, and from there, things only started to look up more and more as more trailers were shown. And with all that finally out of the way, we've made it to the actual release. So, was it worth it? Did it live up to the hype? I'm gonna have to go with a confident yes and no. Let's start with some of the more positive things. This is easily Illumination's best-looking movie to date. It does still have a fair bit of that family-friendly, marketable look that they're known for, but it's very fitting for a Mario movie. Nothing about it feels too stiff or dull, and it's a perfect encapsulation of the 3D Mario games, especially the newer ones. It definitely took me a while to get used to some of the voices, but they all grew on me after some time. I wasn't fond of Chris Pratt's take on Mario from what we heard in the first few trailers, but it feels kinda natural at this point. No actor felt like they were putting on a bad performance, or even a mediocre one, and they melded to their character pretty well. I have my gripes with the plot, but there wasn't anything I absolutely despised. I was a little worried it may feel too short when I saw it would be less than 100 minutes, but it uses that time frame pretty well to tell a fast-paced story without any scenes that go on too long. Even if you find yourself bored at a scene, chances are it'll be over soon. In fact, there aren't even that many scenes that I found to be all that annoying. This is an absolute far cry from that of The Secret Life of Pets, Minions, Sing, and especially Hop. Nah, I had a big, goofy smile on my face from start to finish, and the biggest reason for that is how far they went with the references. This is a movie made by Mario fans, for Mario fans, from the copious leitmotifs to the multiple power-ups, all the way to including characters you may not expect to see. It isn't even just limited to Mario, as you'll see a few references to other Nintendo series if you look close enough. If nostalgia and Easter eggs could carry a movie, this would be an instant 10 out of 10. It's actually amazing just how much better the movie became with all of this extra icing added onto the cake. A cake that, to be honest, isn't very structurally sound. And that brings me to the big problem I have with this movie. If you aren't a Mario fan, half the appeal is instantly gone. I can very much see how this movie would have gotten a rotten score, as many of the professional film critics watching this aren't going to be looking for the same kind of experience that a fan would. And while I enjoyed this movie for everything it does to put a big smile on my face, I genuinely could not have given less of a shit about some of the plot details. Much like the average Mario game, you really won't see anything that will blow you away. Nothing bad, mind you, but very basic. This is meant to be a collection of fun and great moments held together by some semblance of a plot, and while I did praise the pacing earlier, I think it can be a little too breakneck at times. Some scenes just don't get much room to breathe, and some plot points get sped over and completely forgotten about. Again, I don't think the lack of any meaningful plot or script is a bad thing for a Mario movie, but it is a little disappointing, to be honest. Also, many of the jokes just didn't really land for me. At their best, they could squeeze a small smirk or a chuckle out of me, but very rarely did they leave me with anything more than a neutral face. In fact, the script in general wasn't all that stellar either, but once again, I wasn't expecting Shawshank Redemption level writing, so I can give it somewhat of a pass. At the end of the day, judging this movie in the same way I would for most other movies just feels kinda pointless. Granted, I don't give much of the same reservation to the first Sonic movie, but that's because that doesn't feel like an actual Sonic movie, more just a movie with Sonic elements. So yeah, to wrap things up, if you like Mario, you should definitely watch this. It will make you smile for about an hour and 30 minutes, and if you don't care about Mario, maybe skip it. I don't really want to give it a number score since that can very easily change like the tides for a movie like this, so I'm just gonna say I enjoyed it and leave it at that. However, this movie did get me thinking about a lot more beyond that. It's no secret that Nintendo has avoided video game movie adaptations like the plague, especially live-action ones. Not counting anything Pokemon-related, such as the anime or Detective Pikachu or straight-to-TV episodes of shows like Kirby Right Back at Ya and Donkey Kong Country, there have only been 4 film adaptations based solely on a Nintendo property, those being the 1986 Mario Bros. OVA, released only in Japan, the disastrous 1993 live-action Mario movie that ended up being the cause of Nintendo's lack of video game movies, a Japanese-only Animal Crossing anime movie in 2006, and finally, Illumination's own Mario movie. With the success of Illumination's Mario movie, it's likely this number could change, but I don't see us ever getting another live-action Nintendo movie. Detective Pikachu I consider a very big exception, seeing as the Pokemon Company may as well be a whole other entity unrelated, and Pokemon inherently started life as a multimedia franchise. You'd think with how heavily requested a Metroid movie has been, even with Charlie Day and Chris Pratt themselves recently saying they'd love to see it, I don't see it being likely. Had the series been owned by another company, it absolutely would have happened by now. The most I could see is getting something non-committal like the CG anime short Star Fox got back in 2016. Metroid may be my favorite franchise of all time, but I'll be the first in line to admit it doesn't have anywhere near the same widespread appeal as Mario or Zelda. Of course, maybe Nintendo will be willing to take more risks with the success of the Mario movie, but until we see concrete proof, I'll keep my reservations. I have mixed feelings about Nintendo's lack of ambition to bring any of their IPs to the screen, whether that be through movies or even just TV shows, which is something they have done more often, but very rarely outside of just Saturday morning cartoons. On the one hand, it's a little sad not seeing some of my favorites like Fire Emblem or Metroid get any representation outside of gaming, but at the same time, I'm more than grateful we haven't gotten a slew of absolutely terrible adaptations that only serve as cheap cash brags that further oversaturate the market. In the time since the '93 Mario movie, there have been so many god-awful live-action movie adaptations that continue to release to this day. Did you know there have been 12 Resident Evil adaptations? There have also been 12 bad Resident Evil adaptations, but you would think that with more and more recent video game adaptations being surprise hits both critically and commercially, Nintendo would see that as an opportunity to throw their hat into the ring a little more, but I don't think it's that cut and dry. Yes, let's get this out of the way right now. Video game adaptations to film and TV have been in a better place than ever as of late, with stuff like Arcane, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, Castlevania, Sonic 1 and 2, and The Last of Us all raising the bar in one way or another. We have something to look forward to in the future. After all, it's as The Last of Us showrunners said right before the show came out, the video game adaptation curse has been broken with the release of their show. This line received a ton of backlash for a few different reasons. One was that it was just a quote tied to The Last of Us, an inherently divisive series already, but the bigger issue was how it seemed as they were acting like this was the first good video game adaptation ever made. When I thought about it a bit though, I think my main issue with the quote isn't how pretentious it is. I think what he's saying in a vacuum is wrong. In fact, I'm gonna go in the opposite direction and say the curse is either still intact or never even existed in the first place. Alright, that might sound like gibberish, but there's a very clear reason most video game adaptations fall flat on their face, and most modern good ones manage to avoid it because of a few specific reasons. I think there are 3 things that make a good adaptation. Number 1, get people who actually care about the source material. This is fairly obvious, but as we've seen with stuff like Halo and Velma, all too often, people who could not give a rat's ass about what they're working on are put in charge, and you end up with something that disrespects the source material, which is arguably even more insulting than a faithful bad adaptation. Of course, these end up being often bad on their own merits anyway, but that only adds insult to injury. One of the biggest reasons many people love Castlevania, the Sonic movies, and now Mario is that people who actually know their shit get put on board. Hell, Mario had Shigeru Miyamoto himself practically co-creating the movie. Given the cash-grabby nature of most live-action video game adaptations, this is a step that gets missed in the mainstream very often, but it's crucial. Number 2, give people a reason to watch it over just playing the game again. If your plan is just to retell the original game's story with no changes, then what even is the point anymore? If the original story was beloved before, wouldn't it make more sense to just experience that story as originally intended? Many Hollywood game adaptations aren't actually too guilty of this, truth be told, but most of those fully original stories end up being bad anyway for other reasons. I actually think the biggest culprit of this is with anime adaptations of games, and I think this is a great time to bring those up because I don't think they get enough flack simply because discussion of anime adaptations tends to be limited to a few select things, such as an anime not having a good adaptation of a manga, a light novel, or a bad live-action adaptation of an anime. Now, I guess saying this is a little hypocritical of me because my second favorite anime of all time, Clannad, specifically Afterstory, is based on a video game, but I don't count visual novels since those are just books where you click the left mouse button to keep reading. Yeah, every so often we get a masterpiece like Cyberpunk Edgerunners, but for the most part, you will very rarely see an anime adaptation of a game that lives up to its source material. Nier Automata has one of my favorite stories in all of gaming, but I haven't cared enough to check out its recent adaptation because A1 isn't exactly known for making great anime that have anything to do with video games. And it seems like an unspoken law these days that every gacha game needs to receive its own mediocre anime to promote it. If Nintendo had the same mindset these other companies did, we would have 100% gotten Fire Emblem Heroes the animation, and Dragalia Lost the animation, and they very likely would have been shit. Hell, most of these don't even just stop at being soulless, however, and instead find ways to shit all over the original. Scarlet Nexus was a fun, beautiful-looking game that got an absolutely abysmal-looking anime back when it was released that adds absolutely nothing to the franchise. Hell, Nintendo themselves had one of these back in the 90s with Fire Emblem. In case you forgot or never knew, Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem got a 2-episode OVA all the way back in 1996. This was actually the first Fire Emblem product ever released overseas, beating out Blazing Blade by 7 years, and was even dubbed by a lot of the Evangelion dub cast members. There's a reason it was only 2 episodes, though. It was terrible, and got cancelled only 2 episodes in. And yeah, this has been a problem that has existed since the 90s. We've had stuff like Panzer Dragoon and Final Fantasy V, both beloved classics, getting absolutely terrible adaptations through OVAs back in the day. Nintendo would produce more anime adaptations over the years, such as the aforementioned Kirby Right Back Atcha, F-Zero, and now Ring Fit Adventure, I guess? But have mostly been on the sidelines when it comes to that field, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I see people say a Xenoblade anime would be a great idea, but I don't want this series getting a fate as bad as Persona 5 the animation. What good is a worse version of a story we already know? Let's look back at my golden examples from earlier again. Castlevania, Arcane, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, and Sonic. What do all of those have in common? They're fully original stories that are either set in the same world but with new characters that tell a unique story, such as with Cyberpunk, use familiar characters in a new world to tell a unique story, such as with Sonic, utilize the same universe and characters but either tell new stories centered around said characters, such as with Arcane, or go far more in depth with a familiar story, such as Castlevania Seasons 1 and 2. Now you might be thinking, what about my other golden example from earlier, The Last of Us? And yes, this is basically just an all cutscenes compilation of the original game, but here's the thing, in addition to the writers respecting the source material to not tamper with it or add unnecessary BS, The Last of Us was basically already a movie you interacted with. The script slots in naturally for a TV show or movie, which made it very popular with people who had never played the game. It's actually kind of the inverse of Mario, for a sense. Now, I do think there are some games that can never be translated over without losing something, even if you go for an original story, such as with Metal Gear Solid, and still either Nier game. But if you do have to do it, go for this approach. And finally, we have the third and probably most obvious point. Actually make it good. You can put 1,000,000 fans behind the wheel of a project, but if none of them are talented, why bother? I'm not sure why video game movies are allergic to having a good script or even visual effects, but the best I could come up with here is a lack of motivation for the project. Why put your all into a cash grab video game movie or throwaway anime adaptation when you could put that talent elsewhere, like an actually good movie or show? It might not be viable to get the best of the best involved in a project that could just as easily lose the company responsible money. Also, why bother if you know it can soar off brand recognition alone? Didn't matter if Detective Pikachu had bad acting, it was gonna make bank regardless. That's what makes the ones where you can actually tell that not only talented people worked on it, but gave it their all the more special. Arcane isn't just phenomenal by video game adaptation standards, but is also one of the greatest shows I've ever seen in my entire life. In addition to all that, it's also crucial that you get the right people involved. And I'm not talking about just getting fans of the source material, I mean getting people who can do the source material justice. Getting Studio Trigger to animate Cyberpunk Edgerunners was nothing short of pure genius. KyoAni might be my favorite anime studio, but they would never be able to bring the grotesque nature of this show to life in anywhere near the same way. Trigger was known for having insanely animated, edgy as hell shows, and they gave this show all the hyperactive animation, gruesome violence, and most importantly, all the edge it possibly needed to work. It stood out from every single mainstream anime released within 2022 purely because it wasn't just phenomenal, but in just 10 short episodes, it scarred the entire anime community beyond the point of recovery. So yeah, that's my take on the current state of game adaptations, and I guess my opinion on the Mario movie. If the Mario part is what you clicked for, then I thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. If I actually end up finishing this and uploading it, I may cover future things through reviews or other discussion. My next project will likely be a review of Makoto Shinkai's Suzume, which shouldn't take too long to release after this video. I also may have some non-review videos in the works that I hope to actually have the motivation to realize. With all that out of the way, thanks for sticking around to the end. Have a good rest of your day, and take care.